Welcome to Capital H, the podcast where we explore the topics and trends that focus on putting humans at the center of work. I'm your host, David Mallon, Chief Analyst for Deloitte's Research and Sensing team. We're back for our 7th season of Capital H, and we have a familiar treat for you. We're going to explore the findings from our 2021 Human Capital Trends Survey, which after 10 years continues to reveal powerful insights. In 2020, COVID-19 forced organizations around the world to suddenly and fundamentally have to rethink how they do business. And it demanded an immediate mindset shift to a new reality that was literally changing every day. Organizations have weathered this storm and survived, but surviving isn't the same as thriving. So now we have a paradox. How can organizations position themselves to thrive when they're so focused on surviving? In this episode, we'll hear from 5 of my fellow report authors, Erica Bellini, Craig Eaton, Jeff Schwartz, Eve Van Derm, and Shannon Poynton, who discuss key findings from the 2021 report and explore its implications on the work, the workforce, and the workplace, as our organizations emerge from a year that was anything but business as usual.
Let me maybe take the opportunity to just talk a little bit about the approach that we took in 2021, and I'll break it into 2 components. Number one is a little bit of the macro approach from a trends perspective, and then secondly is the theme that we grounded this 2021 report on. So if I just start with the approach, there's always an opportunity after doing things for a decade to sit back and reflect a little bit and think about, are there opportunities to try and amplify the trends a bit more? And as an author team, as we mobilized around 2021, really felt like there was a chance for us to take a bit of a different strategy and move to a biannual approach to delivering the full trends report and using what we have dubbed a bit of the off year to further amplify what we had to say in the full report and really help our clients to activate these trends more effectively within their organization. So 2021 effectively is our very first off year. So what are we using? What are we doing with these off years? There's an opportunity for us to really illuminate more on what's going on in the world. Obviously, this is a unique opportunity, and as we think about the pandemic and its impact, to use that as a bit of a backdrop for our first of what we are planning to be 2 reports within 2021. And so if I now pivot over to what is our theme and how have we gone about this first report that's going to be launching here soon, we kept with the social enterprise theme. But really, as we looked at the pandemic, we felt that there was a unique opportunity to really evaluate what does a big disruptive event, how does that change the way in which organizations think and how they approach being a social enterprise. And so our overall title for this report is The Social Enterprise in a World Disrupted. One of our main mechanisms that informed this report was a survey of over 6,000 individuals across 99 countries, of which 3,600, which represented about 60% of those surveyed, were at the executive level. A couple other really important statistics. Of those executives, we had over 1,200 board and C-suite members and over 230 CEOs. And so what did we really frame our discussion and survey around? It was this premise that a disruptive event like the COVID-19 pandemic really shapes the way in which executives think and how they react and make decisions about their organizations and about the work that they perform and the workforce that performs that work. And so as an example, let me just highlight one finding that was very, very telling. We asked executives how they thought about preparedness pre-COVID and post-COVID to try and understand how their definition of being prepared for a big disruptive event might shift as they have gone through the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we saw is a big shift. About 24% of those surveys actually pivoted from pre-COVID-19, where a majority of their view of preparedness and their planning exercises were centered around a single event or a single view of the future. Post-COVID, we saw, as I mentioned, a 24% increase in executives that were viewing preparedness through a lens around multiple future scenarios and scenarios that were uncertain, scenarios that incorporated unforeseen futures that they have never experienced before. And so we really used that backdrop of disruption and how disruption impacts organizations to focus in on two key areas of our report. Number one is we dove deeper into 5 key trends and really talked about our view and our hypothesis around how disruption has changed organizations' thinking about those trends and what organizations need to do to focus in on adopting these trends to support a move from surviving in the face of disruption to thriving in the face of disruption. And the second section is something that we called leading forward, which was really an opportunity for us to think about the lessons that have been learned over the last 10 years and think about the decade ahead and determine what factors, right, what lessons have been learned that organizations can take as they think about disruption in the future and a world where a perpetual state of disruption will become the norm. Shannon, over to you.
Thanks, Craig, for sharing more about the background of sort of the overall format and some of the themes of this year's report. I think that finding that you highlighted about how executives are really walking away from this past year with a very different view of preparedness and are shifting away from a focus on the familiar towards planning for the unknown is a really interesting one. I'd love to hear from Erica, Eve, and Jeff if there were other findings from this executive survey that Craig just mentioned that you thought were really powerful.
Yeah, Shannon, I'll jump in. And it's funny because it's rare that one of the most exciting findings is the number of respondents. But in this case, I think it actually was. Craig mentioned that we had over 6,000 respondents. But even more exciting than that, we had 3,600 executives respond. And out of that, we had over 1,200 C-suite leaders and board of director members, which is the highest we've ever had by far. And then on top of even that, we had 233 CEOs. And that's really exciting, but I also think it signifies the importance of human capital issues at the top of the house, not just the CHRO. And we talked about this a lot, but the issues that we're tackling for human capital and the focus around remaining distinctly human and how important that's become and the recognition of the power of human potential, especially during this crisis, I think has really propelled human capital to a different place on the executive and board agenda, which is incredibly exciting. And this year, just to add one more statistic, maybe the cherry on top, for the first time in our 11-year history, business respondents outnumbered HR respondents in our survey, 59 to 41%. And I think, again, really speak to the relevance of this topic more broadly across the C-suite and the board, going back to this whole theme of symphonic leadership, working in a symphony, and the idea that as a social enterprise, the issues are so complex that organizations need to work cross-functionally. They need to work in that symphonic manner. I think we're starting to see that in the responses to this survey and also into the teams that are coming to us and asking us to talk about the findings that we have. Jeff and Eve, anything you would add on to that or any other findings that got you guys excited?
Maybe the second finding, I think Craig touched on the first one about preparedness. I think the second one is even closer to my heart about navigating future disruptions and the finding itself that these are human factors to a large extent. And just to highlight the first two is the ability of workers to adapt, reskill, and assume new roles, which is the ability to deal with change was the first factor from a human perspective that is, according to executives, enabling them to navigate future disruptions. And the second is that ability to facilitate rapid decision-making in the way organizations are managing their work and organizing themselves. I think these two are for me, critical elements for future success of organizations, of these respondents and others looking into how to navigate these unfortunate pandemic times.
Well, and to build on that, there's a very interesting narrative that we're summarizing here in the discussion. How our view of preparedness has shifted from predicting what we think is going to happen to being prepared for a much less predictable and a much more disrupted and uncertain future. And in order to prepare for that, as you've discussed just now, Eve, that our focus on adaptability, our ability to make fast decisions, our ability to actually work in a connected, I'll say even in an organic way, is becoming really front and center. And it comes to this third element that you were asking me about, Eve, which is one of the most interesting findings that we had in this year's report, and we had a lot in the report we do every year, is how executives around the world are viewing work transformation and how their view of work transformation itself is evolving. And one of the questions we asked is a question about when you think about work transformation pre-COVID, and when you optimistically think about work transformation post-COVID, which hopefully is happening soon now that we're in this age of the new vaccines, how do you describe it? We saw a very clear shift where the pre-COVID view was very grounded in the idea that work transformation was largely about optimization and efficiency. Or put it another way, a lot of initial work transformation efforts have been about doing the same thing, delivering the same outcomes and outputs, if you will, but doing it faster, more efficiently, with fewer errors. What we're seeing now, and this was one of the numbers that just is imprinted in my brain, which is the number of respondents, again, this is the executive responses that we're thinking about, went from 30% of the executives to 60% of the executives post-COVID are thinking about and defining work transformation in terms of the reimagination of work. That work transformation is shifting from an optimization game to a work reimagination game. How do we design it and put it in action so that we're literally putting in place a new view of work, both looking at what the outcomes are and then looking at how we use technology and how we combine it with people and organization levers to make it happen. This shift from optimization to reimagination and re-architecture is really one of the front and center findings of this year's report.
Yeah, and Jeff, to your point, I mean, this is significant. This is when you change work. You know, we always talk about work. You know, it's like you use the word work. It's not the most motivating word, right? I mean, it's like work. You know, all of a sudden you feel that like drag. I don't know if it's just the way you say the word, but it's like we need to change it to work, right? Work is about unleashing what humans are truly capable of doing, getting them to focus not on producing a series of widgets, but instead, like you said, to focus on driving a set of outcomes. That in turn will help create that sense of connection that we define as purpose, that will help them to unleash, going back to that word, their capabilities, which ties back to potential. And when you use work as a way to focus on outcomes, it gives you a better perspective in terms of what's happening moving forward, because you're not just focused on the here and now, the outcomes that you're trying to get done this minute, but you're focused on those future outcomes that you're trying to achieve that are bigger than just, I need to get, this many products done in this period of time. You're asking much deeper questions. And so it really does become the center of how you can drive purpose, potential, and perspective. And we need to start thinking about and communicating to our clients that work is an incredibly powerful force. And I think that's why CEOs and C-suite leaders are recognizing this need to fundamentally re-architect work and think about work differently, because they are seeing it as that powerful force. And by the way, this is something that is not owned by anyone in the enterprise today. So it is the perfect candidate for symphonic leadership. It is the perfect candidate for, let's say, HR and IT and the business to really work together to think about how to re-architect work for the future, how to tap in to the potential of what work can be, a motivator, an unlocker of creativity and innovation, a way to build relationships, to create knowledge, all of those things that can move organizations forward. And that to me is why this finding was so incredibly exciting to see that recognized at the business level, and then understanding what a great opportunity this is for organizations to really take a major leap forward.
That was awesome. Thank you all. I think a really interesting discussion on the findings from the survey. The title of this year's report is The Social Enterprise in a World Disrupted, Leading the Shift from Survive to Thrive. Maybe I can ask Eve, you to go into this concept of the shift from survive to thrive and why we think it's so important for organizations to adopt a new mindset.
Certainly, and it also links to that emotional response. I think survive is a basic human need, a response to a signal of threat. And I think that's something that we've been describing as one of the options. Like we are in a world disrupted, and a survival mindset sees disruption as something which is a bit of a point in time crisis, something that will go over and that we will then be able to revert to better times, or business as usual as it's sometimes called. And I think that's something which is an interesting dynamic, how individual thought processes, emotions become some sort of an organizational mindset in dealing how we do that today, which it is in part necessary to respond, but it's a bit of a almost quote unquote primitive response to what's happening, a bit of a defensive approach. I think we wanted to pivot to thriving, because this is also where we use the power of creativity and learning of individuals, but bring that to a collective level in terms of how can we embrace that new reality and use that as something which is the basis for creativity in reimagination of norms, assumptions, in looking at reimagining a certain future. And that thrive mindset is bringing that disruption, is something which is part of history, part of evolution. And as humans sometimes forget to learn from history, I think this is a unique opportunity to also embrace the disruption. And we've seen some great cases and examples where this is actually a catalyst to a fundamental change in collective mindset, which is enabling that thrive mindset to create new realities that you can choose for. And I think that's one of these realizations of humans and teams and collectives and organizations, that you are choosing your path forward more than responding to it. And I think that's also what will enable these organizations to succeed today, but also to dominate tomorrow.
Eve, if I may jump in, I think you make a great point about not just preparing for the unforeseen futures, but really becoming a bit more proactive or creative in terms of trying to thrive in the face of those disruptions. I think the survive versus thrive in some people's mind may be a paradox in itself. How do I thrive while I'm in the midst of just trying to survive? And a lot of what we've talked about and what we've written about in our leading forward perspective with regards to work re-architecture and the new view of preparedness and remaining distinctly human at the core are things that organizations need to do out in front of disruption and allow them to more quickly achieve the thrive mindset and thrive while their competition may be trying to strike this balance around surviving in the short term and then ultimately pivoting to thrive. So I think a lot of this has to do with, there was one item here or one quote which I really loved, that proactive may not be the opposite of reactive, right? Creative may be a better way to think about things. And how do organizations leverage these three components to get out in front of disruption and thrive while others are stuck in survive?
And I think to add to that, Craig, I think the symphonic leadership that Erica stressed a few times in this conversation is also a unique opportunity for a leadership team to practice that. Because if I might be struggling to cope with survive and you have the mental space to think about thrive and to reimagine, imagine the power of you and I together in the same leadership team. It's also our obligations as leaders to be able to learn from it and take it to a next level, to sort of prepare future for our organizations, for the leadership teams, and for the people that are contributing to our talent ecosystem.
Thank you, Craig and Eve. That was really a great discussion. And I think you've already teed up part of my next question, which is going to be, how does this shift from survive to thrive depend on being distinctly human? I think you talked about, the importance of sort of embracing possibility in times of disruption. You talked about, setting your own path as part of your response to disruption rather than stalling. Craig, you mentioned that amazing quote that's in the introduction about sort of the importance of creativity during this time. And Eve, you spoke to symphonic leadership. I guess I'll open the floor to others about, anything else you'd add about sort of why this shift from survive to thrive really depends on being distinctly human.
Jeff, you talk about this a lot, and you're probably going to say it more eloquently than I can, but there are things that humans can do that machines simply can't and will never be able to, right? The ability to use judgment to make decisions in rapid fashion, right? If you think about the thriving and you think about the fact that we're going to live in this constant world of disruption, humans' ability to do that, to quickly make those judgment-based decisions with a whole bunch of facts and opinions and just need to be able to make that decision in the moment. That is something that is uniquely and distinctly human. And I think there are many examples of that where, you need those characteristics because in this world of thriving, it's against this backdrop of continued disruption, of things changing at a moment's notice, of not being able to plan in the way that you thought you could have planned before. And that ability to exercise judgment and bring that to the forefront, I think that is so incredibly important and so distinctly human that's in a big part why it takes center stage and why it's so critical now.
And I think, Erica, it reinforces what you introduced about the report and our DNA and the 3 Ps. And I think the perspective one is we are in a unique opportunity to practice growing the DNA on perspective in these accelerated moments of judgments, being bolder and embracing some of the unknowns about technology and other unknowns. So I think this is actually almost cynical, but it's a great opportunity to practice at a very, very high pace.
Yeah, and there's no question, even Erica and Craig, that 2020 has been a year where I think we've all learned more about what we are capable of than we ever could have imagined. In many ways, 2020, and hopefully this is one of a whole bunch of lessons I think we're all hoping that we take from this, which we're driving towards in the 2021 report. We saw the incredible importance and the possibility, rather, of what is possible, what our potential really is. Almost every organization and every team and every person found themselves in 2020 doing something that was not in their job description, which is sort of interesting because we spend so much time designing clear career paths, linear learning programs, clear job descriptions, and yet much of the world found that they were asked to do something that wasn't in their job description. Automobile manufacturers who were making ventilators. Thank goodness for the pharmaceutical industry that previously one of the shortest periods of creating a vaccine in history was the mumps vaccine. I heard this recently, and it took 4 years. This is what people do enabled by technology. We invent. We can do new things. We can create, as we've been talking about here.
Thank you, Jeff. That was fantastic. And, maybe I'll ask Craig if you can just quickly speak to, how some of the 3 Ps from last year's report of purpose, potential, and perspective are really showing up in this year and, in organizations' ability to make quick changes and to thrive in the face of disruption, like the vaccine example that Jeff just gave.
Yeah, sure, Shannon. With respect to purpose, it really is an opportunity to leverage purpose as a rallying cry that mobilizes people across the entire organization, leaders, C-suite, workers, ecosystem partners, to really pull in the same direction as the organization faces current challenges and as they think about future challenges. From a potential perspective, it requires a trust in people and the ways in which they work and allowing them to fulfill their full potential. And what does that really require? It requires a degree of choice to ensure that workers can align their passions with the organizational needs that become even more critical in the face of disruption. And then lastly, embracing the perspective that reimagining or re-architecting work, as Jeff alluded to, is an absolutely key capability to achieve the new outcomes that the world itself in a space of disruption is requiring.
Thank you for that, Craig. Thank you so much, Eve, Erica, Jeff, and Craig for your time today.
It's our view that the shift from survive to thrive depends on an organization becoming and remaining distinctly human at its core. This isn't just a different way of thinking and acting. It's a different way of being, one that approaches every question, every issue, and every decision from a human angle first. It's not just a good idea, it's a mandate for growth. A big thanks to my fellow Human Capital Trends Report authors for their insights. In addition to tuning into our podcast series, you can read our 2021 survey and report online at www.deloitte.com/HCTrends. Thank you for tuning in, and be sure to join us next time as we continue to explore the topics and trends that focus on putting humans at the center of work. This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, please go to deloitte.com/about.